Have you ever thought, why does old-timer boxers stand with that silly boxing stance like this? If you go back and look up photos of boxers from the 19th century, you'll probably be standing like this. And to you and me, it looks pretty stupid, right? Why the hell would you want to box with your hands in this position and your chin up in the air as well? Surely you get knocked straight out from a modern day fighter, right? You would think so. Well, what I'm about to tell you about this stance will probably surprise you, and maybe you will think boxers should go back to standing that way, or maybe not. And also at the end of the video, I'm going to give you some crazy facts from boxers in the 19th century that will blow your mind from what they used to do in that era of boxing. Now back then, this was a very effective fighting style, but surely in a modern day boxing match, a 2022 boxer would likely destroy a fighter from the golden age of boxing, right? But then again, this would depend on which rules they boxed by, because the rules in that period of time was different to the rules today. In most fights back then, neither fighter was wearing gloves. As crazy as this may sound, experts have said boxing without gloves actually widely considered to be safer than boxing with gloves. Among other reasons, bare knuckle boxers back then rarely punched each other in the head with full force. So they said the risk of brain injury or knockouts was dramatically lower. I mean, really? They say with the lack of protective padding on your hands, punching someone full force in the head with full power is the fastest way to seriously damage your hands. With me retiring from boxing with hand injuries, I can definitely, relate to that. Without gloves on, my hands will be finished, especially when you've got to punch someone over and over again. I don't know how fighters could last more than one fight. But also back then, a lot of the 19th century boxers competed multiple times a week. And on top of that, there was no limits of some of the contests. There was one fight in 1983 that went 111 rounds. They just kept on going and going. So with that in mind, you can see why protecting your hands is very important. If you're not wearing gloves and you're not punching someone in the hard head or hitting the elbows, you're going to smash your hands. Now comparing that with today's fighters, I mean, imagine, trying to land a body shot with no gloves on, getting around the elbows like I always talk about on this channel. By 1 inch, you could break your hand. If you're hitting someone hard on the bottom there, your hand's done, the fight is over. So where fighters will be aiming when they're in this boxing stance was on the cheek there, because that's normally a softer target than if you're hitting someone on the head or on the side of the head. And they say this is why so many of the old-time fighters were able to compete so much and continue to fighting for up to 30 years. How crazy is that? And also they say a lot of them was be able to keep their marbles upstairs as well, which I'm finding hard to believe. No gloves, fighting up to 100 rounds, multiple times a week. Nah, they're definitely losing the marbles, right? But this is what the experts say about that golden age. So that's why they had their hands like in this position here with their head up, because they weren't really punching each other in the head. It was the body where they were taking most of the punishments. So why would the hand positioning on the left arm be out like this with the right arm tucked like this? Well, this is partially because it's linked to other rules that the olden boxing matches had, what our boxing matches don't have. Before the Queensberry rules was introduced in 1860, the rules of some of these prize fighters varied, and often these fighters would allow grappling in there as well. An example of evolution of the sport we love: in 1713, a typical boxing match included things like eye gouging, choking, punching, headbutting, kind of like MMA, but more dirty, I guess, with the choking and the eye gouging. Then all of this changed in 1743 when Jack Broughton created the first set of formalized rules for boxing. These rules came after Broughton's defeat of George Stevenson, who suffered many injuries and died a few days after the fight. And it's reported that Broughton was absolutely devastated about the death of his opponent, and he came up with the new Broughton rules to help prevent things like this happening again. These new rules were things like no striking below the belt. Can you believe they let people strike below the belt? And things like stop hitting your opponent while he's on the ground. Instead, give your opponent 30 seconds to recover to see if he wanted to continue the fight. But one rule that he did keep in there back then was grappling. You were still allowed to get over each other and grapple. So the boxing stance from that time helped keep the distance between you and your opponent. And often they did this with both arms stretched out to keep that opponent away. But later they switched just again to keeping up your left hand out and your right hand in like this here. And this was to keep your opponent away with this hand and teasing him. It reminds me of what Vladimir Klitschko does, where he's got his hand out here like this and then he could blast in this one. But they did keep that right hand tucked in here to defend them body shots and defend them hooks with that left hand out, keeping that distance. And as well, with this arm being bent here, what it did was kept it loaded so you could really fire out that big right hand. And then if you got close, you could start grappling with your opponent. Now, even with the introduction of boxing gloves in fights, thanks to the Queensberry rules, before this, gloves were only used in training sometimes. But many boxers still chose not to wear gloves. They still wanted to fight with the bare knuckles. This was up until 1867 when gloves were mandated by the Marquess of Queensberry rules. And then modern day boxing gloves start showing up in the 1890s. And over time, boxing forms evolved from here to here to here, and you've seen all the different stances of the modern day fighters right now, but one stance that we don't see, is this one right here. And I don't think we'd ever go back to this style like this here. There's way better ways of fighting than there was back then. I feel like, I might be wrong, back then they didn't really focus on footwork compared to modern day fighters. Even fighters who do MMA, their footwork is really good. But back then, I didn't see much about footwork. Now I'm going to give you some crazy boxing facts about the history of boxing that will surely blow your mind. Okay, so the first crazy fact. The longest known boxing fight that took place in the history of boxing was in New Orleans, April 6th, 1893. This was for the lightweight world title between Andy Bowen and Jack Burke. And this fight, like I mentioned before, it lasted 111 rounds. But this fight went on for 7 hours of brutal fighting. And when the bell sounded at the end of the 111th round, I can't believe what I'm seeing, both fighters were dazed, exhausted, and they refused to come out of their corners. And the referee ruled the bout a no contest. So after 111 rounds of using their body as punch bags, the contest ended in a tie. But I guess after a fight that long and that grueling, it would be hard to call anyone a loser, right? And now another crazy fact is that mouth guards were not used in a fight until 1913. They didn't wear mouth guards. Before that, fighters were getting their teeth knocked out, getting their lips and their mouth ripped open. Now I can't even imagine doing one round or being punched in the mouth once without a mouth guard. Never mind doing 111 rounds without one either. This is crazy. Recently, I reviewed a lot of people's boxing training videos that have sent me or tagged me on Instagram, and I created this video next, reviewing them all. If you want to laugh, click here and watch this video next.